Come on, don't be dramatic. We're just having a little fun. 4 young men, 1 length of rope, and a 19-year-old farm girl with mud smeared across her face tied to an oak tree in the dark. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood there, perfectly still, and watched them, memorized every face, every voice, every laugh. And what those boys never understood, not for 1 single second that night, was this. She could have ended it in about 4 seconds. Because the quiet farm girl they'd been calling Hillbilly Princess for weeks was an undefeated amateur boxing champion who had walked away from the sport without ever showing her face. She had a promise to keep, a promise made to a dying man in a hospital bed. But every promise has a breaking point, and theirs was coming.
There are towns in this country where nothing much happens, where the mail truck comes at noon, where the church bell still means something, and where a stranger walking down Main Street gets looked at twice. Millbrook Hollow was one of those towns. Not on any map that mattered, just a crossroads, a grain silo, a diner, and a small college on the hill that everyone called Ashford. Folks here worked with their hands. They fixed their own fences. They buried their own dead, mostly in the same cemetery behind the Baptist church. And they believed, most of them, that you could tell a person's whole story just by looking at their boots. This is a story about how wrong that belief can be. It starts on a gray Tuesday morning in September. The kind of morning where the fog sits low over the fields and you can hear a rooster before you can see the sun. A pickup truck, 20 years old, if it was a day, pulled up the gravel drive of a small farmhouse on the edge of town. Behind the wheel sat a young woman, 19 years old, quiet eyes, worn jacket, a duffel bag in the back seat that held everything she owned. Her name was Grace Whitfield, and she was new here. Not new to farm life, not new to hard work, but new to Millbrook Hollow, new to that porch light flickering above the door, new to the old man waiting on the steps, leaning on a cane he didn't used to need. That man was her grandfather, Earl Whitfield. He hadn't seen Grace in almost 3 years, not since the last time the whole family had gathered in one room back before the losses started piling up the way bad weather does. Now she was standing in his driveway holding a bag, looking older than 19 should look. He didn't say much. He never did. He just opened his arms and she walked into them, and for a moment neither one of them said a word. Sometimes silence says more than a speech ever could. That first night, after a supper of eggs and toast, because that was mostly what Earl kept in the house these days, Grace lay awake in the same small bedroom she'd stayed in as a child during summer visits. The wallpaper hadn't changed. Faded roses peeling slightly at one corner near the window. She listened to the house settle around her, the particular creak of old wood cooling after a warm day, the distant sound of Earl's television playing low down the hall. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that she'd fallen asleep without the sound of a gym somewhere nearby. No rope skipping against concrete, no trainer shouting instructions through the walls, just crickets outside the window, and an old man's television, and the particular quiet of a house that had seen a lot of years pass through it. She slept better that night than she had in months. Let me tell you a little about Earl. He was 74 years old, a farmer his whole life. But before that, long before that, he had another life, one that most people in town had forgotten or never knew at all. A life that involved a boxing ring, a pair of gloves, and a young man's dream of being somebody. Earl didn't talk about those years much anymore. His heart wasn't what it used to be. He'd been feeling it for months now. The tightness in his chest on the stairs, a shortness of breath that hadn't been there the year before. He hadn't told Grace how bad it had gotten, not yet. He just told her he was glad she was home. And she was. Grace didn't come to Millbrook Hollow because life had been kind to her. She came because her grandfather was the only family she had left. Her mother had passed when she was a child, back when Grace was young enough that the grief had folded itself quietly into the shape of her whole childhood, present in almost everything spoken of in almost nothing. Her father, a good man, a strong man, had died about a year back from a heart condition that ran in the family, like a curse passed down through generations. And somewhere in between all that loss, Grace had built a life for herself, a life she left behind completely when she packed that duffel bag. A life involving a boxing gym in a city 3 states away. A life where, under a name that wasn't her own, she had become something of a legend. They called her the Quiet Storm because she never bragged, never talked trash, never smiled for the cameras. She just won. Fight after fight, she won. Until the day her father's heart gave out and the whole world she'd built for herself suddenly felt very far from what actually mattered. She'd stayed only long enough to bury him, then gone back to training within a few weeks because grief needs somewhere to go, and the gym was the only place she knew how to put it. But something inside her had already started to change. The fights started to feel hollow. The crowds started to feel far away. And when Earl called several months later to tell her his own heart wasn't doing so well either, she didn't hesitate for even a single day. She packed 1 duffel bag, told her coach she was done, and drove 11 hours home without stopping more than twice. No press conference, no goodbye interview. She simply vanished from that world and came home to the one thing that mattered more than any championship belt: family. Now nobody in Millbrook Hollow knew a single thing about that. To them, she was just Earl Whitfield's granddaughter, the quiet girl who helped around the farm, the girl who kept her head down and her hands busy. And that, as it turned out, was exactly how the trouble started. Let me take you across town now, up the hill past the old grain elevator to a place called Ashford College. It wasn't a big school, maybe 2,000 students, but it had money, old money. The kind that built new gymnasiums and put up statues of men nobody under 60 remembered. And this particular fall, Ashford had a golden boy. Ashford College mattered to Millbrook Hollow in ways that went beyond the classroom. Half the businesses on Main Street depended one way or another on the college's presence. The diner fed its students. The hardware store supplied its maintenance crews. The farms around town, including Earl's, sold produce to its cafeteria kitchens every week of the school year. It was the kind of quiet economic thread that held a small town together, invisible until somebody pulled on it hard enough to matter. His name was Tyler Cross, 18 years old, first-year student, captain of the amateur boxing team before he'd even finished his first semester. Tyler had grown up believing the world owed him something. Maybe because it usually did give it to him. His father, Richard Cross, sat on the board of trustees. His name was stitched onto a building near the science hall. Tyler had never once been told no in his entire life, at least not in any way that stuck. He was handsome in the way that magazines like, charming in the way that fools mistake for kindness, and underneath all of it, something a little rotten. The kind of rotten that money tends to cover up the way paint covers rust. He didn't know Grace Whitfield, not yet, but he was about to make her acquaintance in the worst possible way. It happened on a Saturday, 4 days after Grace arrived at the farmer's market that set up every week in the town square. Grace had come to sell what the farm could spare: a crate of apples, some late tomatoes, a few jars of honey from Earl's hives. She wasn't loud about it, she never was. She just set her table, arranged her baskets, and waited. That's when Tyler and 3 of his friends came strolling through, fresh off a morning workout, still wearing their college gym shirts like a badge of honor. They were loud, the way young men get loud when they think the world is watching and admiring them. One of them, a boy named Josh, bumped Grace's table on purpose, not hard enough to look like an accident, hard enough to send a crate of apples tumbling into the dirt. Grace didn't yell. She didn't even flinch. She just knelt down and started picking them up, one by one. That's when Tyler stepped in. Not to help, to make it worse. He picked up an apple, turned it over in his hand like he was inspecting a piece of junk at a yard sale. "You grow these yourself?" he said, loud enough for a small crowd to hear. "Looks like it. Smells like it, too." His friends laughed. Somebody pulled out a phone. Grace kept picking up apples. "Bet you don't even go to school," Tyler said. "Bet you never left this dirt road in your whole life." More laughter. "Hillbilly princess," Josh called out. Grace stood up. She held a bruised apple in one hand, and she looked at Tyler with an expression that wasn't fear and wasn't anger either. It was something calmer than both, something that made a few of the older folks in the crowd go quiet, even if they couldn't say why. "You dropped these," she said. "I'm just picking them back up." Tyler smirked. He tossed the apple back onto her table a little too hard, and it rolled off the other side and hit the ground. "Oops," he said. "Guess that one's ruined too." The phone kept filming. A few students laughed, along the way people laugh when they're afraid to be the one who stays quiet, because nobody wants to be the next target. That's how bullying works in a schoolyard or a boardroom or a farmer's market. It isn't just the bully doing the damage. It's every person standing close enough to stop it, choosing not to. Grace didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't run. She looked Tyler dead in the eye and she said one sentence. Quiet, but clear enough for the whole crowd to hear. "I'm not looking for trouble, but don't mistake my silence for fear." Then she bent down, gathered the last of her apples, and started walking away. Tyler called something after her, something about how she'd better watch herself around campus. She didn't turn around. Now here's the thing about that moment. Most people in that crowd went home and forgot about it by supper time. A girl got teased at the market. Happens every week somewhere. But two people didn't forget. One of them was a middle-aged man standing near the coffee stand watching the whole thing with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight. His name was Walt Daniels. Everybody called him Coach. He ran the boxing program over at Ashford, had for almost 15 years. He watched Tyler and his friends walk off laughing, and something about it bothered him more than he expected. He'd seen plenty of young men with too much confidence and too little character. But something about the girl's face stuck with him. That calm. That stillness. He'd only seen that particular kind of stillness in one other place in his whole life. In a boxing ring, right before the bell rings, in the eyes of a fighter who already knows how the fight is going to end. He shook the thought off, told himself he was imagining things, went back to his coffee. But he remembered it. He'd remember it again soon enough. The other person who didn't forget that day was Grace herself, not because of anger, she'd been called worse things by worse people, but because it reminded her of something her father used to say, back when she was young and just starting to learn how to fight. "Grace," he told her once, wrapping her hands before a sparring session, "a loud mouth isn't strength, it's fear wearing a costume." She thought about that the whole walk home, past the grain elevator, past the old church, past the sign that said, "Welcome to Millbrook Hollow, population 2,204. By the time she got back to the farm, her arms were tired from carrying baskets, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Earl was on the porch when she got home, sitting in his usual chair, a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He took one look at her face and knew something had happened. "Rough day at market?" he asked. She shrugged. "Nothing I can't handle." Earl studied her for a long moment, the kind of look only a grandfather gives. "You know," he said slowly, "your daddy used to come home looking just like that. Same look in his eye." Grace sat down on the step beside him. "What look is that?" "The look of somebody deciding whether or not to let something go." She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the field behind them. Somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet. "I let it go," she finally said. Earl nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That's harder than fighting. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise." They sat together in silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that isn't empty. The kind that holds things. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand something about Earl Whitfield. He wasn't just an old farmer with a bad heart and a quiet granddaughter. He had a past of his own. 40 years ago, before the farm, before the wife he lost too early, before any of it, Earl had been a boxer himself. Not a famous one, not a champion, but good. Good enough to have trained a few young fighters over the years, back when he still had the strength for it. Good enough to know real talent when he saw it. And good enough to recognize deep down exactly what his granddaughter was capable of. Because Earl was the one who taught her first. Back when she was 12 years old, grieving her mother, angry at a world that didn't make sense yet. He'd put a pair of old gloves in her hands and told her something he still believed with his whole heart. Anger needs somewhere to go, Gracie. Better it goes into leather than into people. She'd taken to it the way some people take to music or to prayer. Quietly. Completely. Her father had picked up where Earl left off once the family moved a little further from the farm for a stretch of years, wrapping her hands before every practice, standing at the edge of the mat with his arms crossed, watching his daughter with the kind of pride he rarely put into words. By the time she was 16, local trainers 3 towns over were already whispering about her. By 18, she'd left home for a proper gym 3 states away, training under a coach who saw something rare in her, and within a matter of months, she was fighting under a mask of anonymity that felt safer than her own name. The Quiet Storm. Undefeated in every amateur bout she ever fought. Now back in the barn behind Earl's farmhouse, there sat an old wooden trunk. Inside that trunk, wrapped in a soft cloth, sat a pair of boxing gloves, worn leather, laces gone gray with age. Earl kept them there like a man keeps a photograph he isn't ready to look at every day, but isn't ready to throw away either. That evening after supper, he asked Grace to put something away in the barn for him. "Careful with that trunk," he told her, "and don't let anybody go poking through it, not even you, not too much. Some things are better left folded up quiet." Grace didn't ask questions. She'd learned a long time ago that some doors open on their own time. She carried the trunk into the barn, set it in its usual corner, and before closing the lid, she let her fingers brush across the old gloves inside. There were 2 letters stitched faintly into the inside lining, worn almost smooth by years of handling. Q.S. She paused for a moment, looking at them. Then she closed the trunk and went back inside to check on her grandfather's evening routine, because that mattered more right then than old mysteries in a barn. But the letters stayed with her a little longer than she expected. Small things do that sometimes. They sit quiet in the back of your mind, waiting for the day they'll matter. Before we go further, let me tell you a little more about the town itself, because a story like this one isn't just about 2 people. It's about everyone standing around them, watching, deciding whether to speak up or stay quiet. Millbrook Hollow had one church that mattered the way most small towns do. First Baptist, on the corner of Route 9 and Cedar Lane, white paint peeling a little at the edges, bell tower older than anyone living could remember. Grace started going that first Sunday after she arrived, not because she was especially devout, but because Earl asked her to sit with him, and some requests from an old man you love you just don't refuse. The pews were full of familiar faces to everyone but her. Farmers in their one good shirt, wives who'd known each other since grade school, a few Ashford students who came for the free lunch afterward more than the sermon itself. Nobody was unkind to Grace at church. Small towns rarely are, not to your face, not on holy ground. But nobody went out of their way either. She was new. Newness takes time to wear off in a place like this. She sat beside Earl in the 3rd pew from the back, the same pew he'd sat in with his late wife for 40 years, and she listened to a sermon about the Good Samaritan, about how kindness is easy to preach and hard to practice, especially toward strangers. She thought about that sermon more than once in the weeks that followed. Because Millbrook Hollow, like most places, had 2 kinds of people in it: those who looked at a stranger and wondered what she could offer them, and those who looked at a stranger and simply offered kindness first without needing a reason. There was a young woman named Ruth Calder in that congregation, sitting a few rows up, who Grace didn't know yet, but would come to rely on more than almost anyone else in this story. Pastor Whitmore, an old man with a voice like gravel and a heart soft as bread, was the second kind too. Tyler Cross and the family he came from were most certainly the first. That difference, small as it might seem on a quiet Sunday morning, would end up mattering more than anyone in that church could have guessed. Now let me take you back to the farm for a while, because life there had its own rhythm, too separate from the trouble brewing across town. Grace's days followed a pattern as old as farming itself. Up before the sun, feeding the chickens, checking the fence line for the gap that groundhog kept digging under. Milking the 2 cows Earl still kept more out of habit than necessity. Then breakfast, simple, eggs and toast, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, sitting across from her grandfather at a table that had seated 4 people once, and now seated 2. Earl liked to talk about the old days over breakfast, not the boxing days, those he kept locked up tighter than that trunk in the barn. He liked to talk about Grace's grandmother instead, about how she used to hum while she canned tomatoes, about the year the drought nearly took the whole crop and how they'd made it through anyway, the way families do. Grace listened to these stories the way a person listens to rain on a tin roof, not for the words exactly, for the comfort of the sound. She was healing slowly in that farmhouse. Grief doesn't leave all at once. It leaves in pieces, the way frost leaves a window in the morning sun. And work helped. Work always helps. There is something honest about a day spent with your hands in the dirt. Something that quiets the mind in a way that words rarely manage. By afternoon, she'd usually drive into town sometimes to sell what the farm could spare, sometimes just for supplies, sometimes to stop by a small diner just off Main Street for 20 minutes of conversation that felt more and more like real friendship. That diner belonged to the same young woman she'd noticed at church. Her name was Ruth Calder. She ran the place her mother had built, the kind of diner with a bell over the door and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed in a decade. Ruth was in her late 20s, sharp-eyed, quick-witted, the kind of woman who'd grown up waiting tables since she was old enough to carry a tray. She'd noticed Grace the very first week she came to town sitting alone at the counter with a cup of coffee she made stretch for an hour, clearly not wanting to spend more than she had to. Ruth had slid a slice of pie in front of her one afternoon, unasked, and said simply, "On the house. Looked like you needed something sweet today." Grace had been surprised by the kindness. Small towns can be cold to newcomers, and she'd braced herself for exactly that. But Ruth wasn't cold. Ruth was the kind of woman who believed everyone deserved a fair chance before judgment, and she extended that fairness to Grace without a second thought. Over the following weeks, a quiet friendship began to form between them. Nothing dramatic, just small kindnesses, a cup of coffee, a few minutes of conversation, the occasional ride into town when Grace's truck gave her trouble. It was the first real friendship Grace had made since coming to Millbrook Hollow, and it mattered more to her than she let on. Ruth had heard about the incident at the market, of course. Word travels fast in a town that small. She'd heard about Tyler Cross too, and not for the first time. Ashford students came into her diner all the time, and Tyler was a regular, usually loud, usually demanding, usually leaving a smaller tip than the bill deserved. Ruth didn't like him. She'd never said so out loud, not wanting to lose his family's business, but she didn't like the way he talked to her waitstaff, or the way he laughed at things that weren't funny. She recognized the type. Every small town has 1 or 2 families like the Crosses, money enough to make people look away from bad behavior. But Ruth had never been the kind of person who looked away easily. That would matter later on, more than anyone realized yet. It was on one of those afternoons, a rainy Tuesday, that Ruth first asked Grace directly about her past. "You don't talk much about before," Ruth said, refilling Grace's coffee without being asked. "Before Millbrook Hollow, I mean." Grace wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Not much to tell," she said. Ruth raised an eyebrow the way people do when they know a lie of omission when they hear one, but respect a person enough not to push. "Fair enough," she said. "Everybody's got a chapter or 2 they keep closed. Long as you're not running from the law, I don't need the details." Grace almost smiled at that. "No," she said, "nothing like that." "Good," Ruth said, sliding a slice of pie across the counter, unasked, as always. "Then eat your pie and stop looking so serious. Whatever it was, it's behind you now." Grace ate the pie, and for a little while, sitting in that warm diner with rain streaking down the windows, whatever it was really did feel behind her. She had no way of knowing yet how soon her past and her present were about to collide, right there in Millbrook Hollow, in front of the whole town. Let's step back to the farm for a moment, because there's something happening there too, quiet as it is. Earl's health was not improving, If anything, it was slipping slow and steady, the way water finds its way through a crack in a dam. He'd started needing help getting up the porch steps. He'd started sitting down more between chores, catching his breath in a way he tried to hide from her. Grace watched all of this happen with the particular kind of fear that only comes from having already lost one parent to the same disease. She started doing more of the farm work herself so Earl could rest, and every night, after Earl went to bed, she would step out into the barn alone. Not to train. She'd left that life behind, she told herself. But she would sit near that old wooden trunk and sometimes, just sometimes, she would open it and run her fingers over those worn gloves, remembering her father's hands, wrapping hers before every sparring session all those years ago, remembering the promise she'd made him near the end when his own heart had already begun failing. "Promise me something, Gracie," he'd said, voice thin as paper in that hospital bed. "Promise me you'll never use those hands out of anger. Only out of love. Love for the sport, love for the people worth protecting. Never revenge. Revenge isn't strength, baby girl. It's just another kind of losing." She had promised, and she meant to keep that promise no matter what Tyler Cross and his friends threw her way. But promises get tested. That's the whole point of them. And hers was about to be tested harder than she ever expected. About 3 weeks after the market incident, on a bright, cool afternoon in early October, everything shifted just slightly in a way almost nobody noticed. Grace was walking back from town, cutting across the edge of the Ashford campus because it saved her nearly a mile of road. She'd done it a handful of times before without any trouble. This time, Tyler and 2 of his friends were tossing a football on the quad when they spotted her. "Well, look who it is," Tyler called out. "The Apple Girl." His friends laughed. One of them, a stocky boy named Marcus, jogged over and cut across her path, blocking her way with his body, grinning like it was all in good fun. "Where you headed, farm girl? Got a hoe to get back to?" Grace tried to step around him. He stepped with her, still grinning, still blocking. "Come on now, don't be rude," he said. "We're just being friendly." Tyler wandered over, slow and confident, the way a man walks when he's never once worried about consequences. "You know," he said, "you should smile more. Might make people forget how you smell like a barn." More laughter. A couple of students passing by slowed down to watch phones already halfway out of pockets because that's the world now. Everything is content, even cruelty. Tyler reached out and gave Grace's shoulder a shove. Not hard, just enough to make his friends laugh. Just enough to remind her, in his mind anyway, exactly where she stood in the pecking order of Millbrook Hollow. But something happened in that half-second that Tyler didn't expect and didn't understand. Grace's body moved. Not away in fear. It moved the way a trained body moves. Automatic, efficient. A slight pivot of the hip, a shift of weight onto the back foot, a subtle roll of the shoulder that absorbed the shove and redirected it so that, instead of stumbling, she simply stepped, smooth as water, out of the path of his hand entirely. It happened so fast most people wouldn't have noticed, but someone did. Coach Daniels had been crossing the quad on his way back from the gymnasium, arms full of clipboards, when he caught the whole scene out of the corner of his eye. He stopped walking. He watched Tyler shove at the girl, watched her move, and something in the back of his mind, something that had been sitting quiet since that day at the farmer's market, sat up and took notice. That wasn't luck. That wasn't an accident. That was footwork. That was training. That was years of somebody drilling instinct into a body until it didn't have to think anymore. He'd seen that kind of movement exactly twice before in his life. Once in a professional gym watching a former Olympic hopeful shadowbox before a title bout. And once a very long time ago in an old newsreel clip his own father used to show him of a boxer nobody talked about anymore. Coach Daniels didn't say anything. He just stood there, clipboards in hand, watching Grace continue walking, calm as still water, while Tyler and his friends laughed behind her, oblivious to what had actually just happened. She hadn't reacted with anger. She hadn't reacted with fear. She'd simply moved out of harm's way, the way water moves around a rock without ever losing its shape. That night, Coach Daniels sat at his kitchen table long after his wife had gone to bed, turning the moment over in his mind like a coin he couldn't quite place the value of. He told himself it was nothing. Small towns are full of coincidences. But something told him to keep watching. And in this story, as in most true ones, that little voice was worth listening to. A few days after that incident on the quad, Grace drove Earl to the county hospital for a checkup that had been sitting on the calendar for weeks. The waiting room smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee. A television in the corner played a rerun of some game show nobody was watching. Earl sat in a wheelchair he insisted he didn't need, grumbling the whole time about how doctors just liked making a man feel older than he was. Grace held his hand anyway, the way you hold the hand of someone you're afraid to lose twice. When the doctor finally called them back, he laid it out plainly, the way good doctors do when they respect a patient enough not to soften hard truths. "Mr. Whitfield, your heart is working harder than it should. We need to do the bypass, and soon. I'd like to schedule it within the next 2 weeks." Earl nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already made peace with something his body has been telling him for a while. Grace felt her stomach tighten. "Is that safe?" she asked. "At his age?" "It's safer than waiting," the doctor said gently. "But I need you to understand something. Between now and then, he needs calm, rest, low stress. A heart under this much strain doesn't handle shocks well, emotional or physical." Grace looked at her grandfather, who was already trying to wave the whole conversation off like it was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "I'll make sure of it," she said quietly. Driving home that afternoon, Earl stared out the truck window at the fields rolling by, gold and brown under the autumn sun. "You don't need to fuss over me, Gracie," he said. "I've had a good long run." "Don't talk like that," she said, sharper than she meant to. He glanced at her, something soft passing behind his tired eyes. "All right," he said. "I won't. But you remember something for me. Whatever happens with this old heart of mine, you keep yours soft. You hear me? Don't let this world harden it. That's the one thing I couldn't stand watching happen to you." Grace didn't answer right away. She just reached over and squeezed his hand once, the two of them riding the rest of the way home. In the kind of silence that says everything words can't. That night, after Earl had gone to bed, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table with the doctor's instructions spread out in front of her. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of keeping her grandfather calm, rested, and far away from stress. She had no idea yet just how hard that promise was about to become to keep, with Tyler Cross and his friends circling closer with every passing day, and a whole town about to be pulled into a storm none of them saw coming. For now, though, let's return to that night at the farmhouse, the one that would close out this chapter of the story. It was a Thursday evening, only a few days after the doctor's appointment. The air had turned cool enough for jackets. The leaves along the county road had started to turn that deep orange color that makes people slow their cars down just to look. Earl had gone to bed early, tired from a long day, his color a little too pale for Grace's comfort. She'd checked on him twice, made sure his water was full, made sure the phone was charged by his bedside in case he needed to call her in the night. Then she'd walked out to the barn the way she often did before bed, just to be alone with her thoughts for a little while. The barn smelled like hay and old wood and diesel fuel, the way barns always do. She sat down near the trunk, and this time she opened it all the way. She lifted the gloves out gently, turning them over in her hands. They were her father's gloves originally, given to him by Earl decades ago when he himself had been young and hopeful and full of dreams about what those hands could accomplish. Passed down like a family Bible, except this one had leather covers and the smell of old sweat instead of old paper. Grace held them to her chest for a long moment, eyes closed, and let herself remember. Just for a minute. Just long enough to feel close to the people she'd lost. She didn't hear the barn door creak open behind her. "Didn't expect to find you out here this late." She turned, startled, and found Coach Daniels standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking a little embarrassed for intruding. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Your grandfather mentioned you might be out here. I stopped by to check on Earl. He didn't look well last time I saw him at the feed store." Grace stood still, holding the gloves. "He's resting," she said. Doctor's got him scheduled for surgery soon. Coach Daniels nodded slowly, his eyes drifting almost involuntarily to the gloves in her hands. He'd known Earl Whitfield for years, bought eggs from him, talked crops and weather with him at the diner counter. He'd never once known Earl to keep old boxing gloves lying around. "Those his?" he asked, nodding toward them. Grace hesitated. "My father's, originally. Earl's before that." Coach Daniels stepped a little closer, close enough to see the faint stitching along the inside cuff.
2 letters, worn nearly smooth. Q.S.
His breath caught just slightly in a way he tried to hide. He'd heard those initials before. Years ago, in gyms and gossip and grainy amateur circuit footage passed hand to hand among old trainers who still cared about the sport the way it used to be. A fighter who never showed her face to cameras, never gave interviews, won every single amateur bout she ever fought, and then disappeared from the sport entirely, without a word of explanation, at the exact moment offers for something bigger started rolling in. They called her the Quiet Storm. Coach Daniels had never seen her fight in person, only heard about her the way you hear about a comet that passed through years before you were old enough to look up. He looked at Grace now standing there in the lantern light of an old barn, holding a pair of worn gloves like they were the most precious things she owned. And for the first time he let himself really consider something he'd been pushing away since that day at the farmer's market. That flinch he'd witnessed on the quad, that perfect, effortless footwork, that stillness in her eyes that had unsettled him from the very first moment he saw her. He didn't say anything about his suspicion, not yet. Some truths need time before they're ready to be spoken out loud. "Take care of your grandfather," he said instead, tipping his hat. "And take care of yourself, too. This town's got a way of underestimating people it shouldn't." Grace watched him go, feeling something she couldn't quite name settle over her. She placed the gloves carefully back into the trunk, closed the lid, and walked back to the house under a sky full of more stars than any city she'd ever lived in could offer. Inside, Earl was asleep, his breathing steady and even. Grace sat by his bedside for a while, the way she did most nights now, just listening to him breathe, grateful for every single one. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the scent of harvest and the coming cold of winter. And somewhere across town, in a dormitory that smelled like money and ambition, Tyler Cross was already planning his next move. Because bullies like Tyler rarely stop on their own. They escalate, not because they're powerful, but because somewhere deep down they mistake other people's kindness for weakness and other people's patience for permission. Grace Whitfield had shown patience. She had shown restraint. She had kept the promise she made to her father, holding on to Grace even when Grace was hard to hold. But every promise, no matter how sincere, eventually meets a moment that tests it beyond anything reasonable. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would not just test Grace Whitfield. It would test an entire town's willingness to look away or, finally, after everything, to stand up and see clearly. For now, though, on that quiet October night, all Grace Whitfield wanted was for her grandfather to keep breathing steady until morning. Everything else, she told herself, could wait. She had no idea how wrong she was about that. Outside, the temperature kept dropping the way it does in early October when summer finally admits it's over and autumn settles in for good. Somewhere down the county road, a truck engine turned over twice before catching, then faded into the distance. The farmhouse creaked once, quietly, the way old houses do when they're simply breathing through another night. Grace stood at her bedroom window for a moment before finally lying down, looking out at the dark shape of the barn, at the old oak trees lining the property, at a sky so full of stars it made the troubles of the day feel briefly, mercifully small. She had no way of knowing that a different tree on the far edge of that same county was about to become the setting for the hardest night of her life. Let me leave you with something before we move into the next part of this story. We live in a world quick to judge a person by what they wear or how quiet they stay in a crowded room. We assume the loudest voice is the strongest one. We assume the person who never fights back has nothing worth fighting for. But real strength rarely announces itself. It shows up in a young woman choosing patience over pride again and again because she made a promise to someone she loved. It shows up in an old man teaching a grieving child to put her anger into something safe instead of letting it curdle into bitterness. It shows up in a diner owner who serves kindness before she asks a single question. And it shows up in a coach who trusts his instincts enough to keep watching even when the whole town has already decided there's nothing worth watching at all. Grace Whitfield had spent her whole life being underestimated. By classmates who never saw past the mud on her boots. By a sport that only valued her while she was winning. And now by a young man who mistook her silence for surrender. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it is true far outside the borders of Millbrook Hollow too. Most of us have met somebody like Grace at some point. The quiet coworker nobody asks for input. The elderly neighbor everyone assumes has nothing left to offer. The new face in town that the whole community decides without ever really looking must not have much of a story worth knowing. We are usually wrong about that. Almost every single time. Hers was about to be tested harder than anything she had ever faced inside a boxing ring. Not by an opponent trying to beat her, but by a whole town's willingness to look the other way and by her own quiet resolve to hold on to Grace even when the world around her seemed determined to take it from her. Every story about a bully has a turning point. A moment where teasing stops being teasing, where laughter stops being harmless, where something crosses a line that can never be uncrossed again. This part of the story is about that turning point. But before we get there, let's catch our breath for a moment and remember where we left things. Grace Whitfield was settling into life on her grandfather's farm, though settling might be too gentle a word for it. Earl's heart was growing weaker with each passing week. The surgery the doctor had scheduled was drawing closer every single day, a date circled quietly on the kitchen calendar that neither of them talked about directly. Coach Daniels had seen something in Grace he couldn't quite explain, a flinch, a flash of skill. 2 letters stitched into an old pair of gloves, and Tyler Cross, spoiled, restless, and used to getting his way, had already decided Grace Whitfield was fair game. He was about to prove just how far that belief could carry a young man with no one willing to stop him. Let's begin. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of October, the kind where the sky can't decide between rain and sun, so it gives you a little of both. Grace had driven into town that morning to deliver eggs and a few jars of preserves to Ruth's diner, something the two of them had worked out as a quiet little arrangement. Ruth paid fair prices, no questions asked, and always threw in a free meal besides. She was sitting at the counter finishing a cup of coffee when the bell over the door jingled, and Tyler Cross walked in with 3 friends trailing behind him. Ruth's shoulders tensed the moment she saw him. Not fear, exactly, more like the tired dread of a woman who knew a difficult customer when she saw one. They took the corner booth loud as always, ordering burgers and milkshakes like they owned the building. Ruth handled them the way she handled every customer, professional, polite, nothing more, nothing less. But Tyler had noticed something that afternoon. He'd noticed Grace sitting at the counter, and he'd noticed how comfortable she seemed with Ruth, laughing quietly at something Ruth had said just before he walked in. That bothered him more than it should have. Bullies like Tyler don't just want to hurt the person in front of them. They want to isolate that person, cut away anyone who might make them feel less alone. So when Ruth came by their table to take the order, Tyler looked her up and down with a smirk that had nothing friendly in it. "You always this friendly with the help?" he asked, nodding toward Grace at the counter. Ruth kept her voice even. "Grace isn't help. She's a supplier and a friend." "Didn't know diners were so charitable," Tyler said, glancing at his friends for approval. "Feeding strays and all." One of his friends laughed. Ruth didn't. "You want to order, or you want to keep talking?" she said, pen ready over her notepad, patience wearing thin but professionalism holding steady. Tyler leaned back in the booth, enjoying himself. "Just making conversation," he said. "No need to get defensive." Grace at the counter had heard every word. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the tension in the air, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. When Ruth came back behind the counter a few minutes later, her jaw was tight. "You all right?" Grace asked quietly. "Fine," Ruth said, though her voice said otherwise. That boy's got more nerve than sense. Grace felt something twist in her stomach. Guilt, maybe. The particular kind of guilt that comes from watching someone else get pulled into your trouble. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's only doing this because of me." Ruth shook her head firmly. "No, he's doing this because of him. Don't you dare carry blame that isn't yours to carry." It was a small moment, just words exchanged over a diner counter, but it planted something in Grace that would matter later, the reminder that cruelty always tries to make its victims feel responsible for it, and the reminder that real friends refuse to let that happen. Tyler and his friends left 20 minutes later, tossing a tip on the table that was, Ruth noted dryly, exactly the amount you'd leave if you wanted to seem generous without actually being generous. But the damage of the afternoon wasn't in the tip. It was in the seed Tyler had planted in his own mind. The idea that Grace Whitfield's little circle of allies needed trimming down. That anyone kind to her should learn one way or another that kindness toward her came with a cost. That idea would not stay small for long. Grace didn't know any of this yet, of course. She only knew that the walk home from the diner that afternoon felt heavier than usual, the way a day feels heavier when you sense trouble circling closer without being able to name exactly where it's coming from. She thought about the market, about the quad, about the particular look on Tyler's face each time, a look she recognized now for what it was. Not anger, exactly, something colder than that. The look of a young man testing how far a boundary could be pushed before somebody finally pushed back. She wondered, walking past the grain elevator in the fading afternoon light, how many more times that boundary would be tested before something gave way. She had no way of knowing the answer was already circling closer than she thought. Now, let's talk about something Grace didn't know yet. Something that would explain a great deal about why Tyler Cross behaved the way he did and why nobody around him seemed willing to stop it. Tyler had not always attended Ashford College. He'd started his freshman year somewhere else entirely, a university 2 states over, chosen mostly because his father had gone there and wanted his son to follow the family tradition. It hadn't gone well. During a fraternity initiation ritual in his very first semester, Tyler and a group of upperclassmen had taken a hazing tradition too far. A younger pledge, barely 18, had ended up in the hospital with a fractured collarbone and a concussion that kept him out of classes for nearly a month. The university had opened an investigation. Tyler had been one of the names identified as a ringleader, not the only one, but far from innocent. That was when Richard Cross had stepped in. Money moved quietly in situations like that. A donation here, a quiet conversation there. Lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear before they ever reached a courtroom or a headline. The injured student's family had eventually settled privately for a sum large enough to keep them from pursuing anything further. The university had allowed Tyler to withdraw quietly, rather than face formal expulsion, sparing everyone the embarrassment of a public scandal, and Richard Cross had made a generous donation to Ashford College the very same semester his son transferred in. Nobody at Ashford asked many questions. Money has a way of discouraging questions. Tyler had learned an important lesson from all of that, though. Not the one his father hoped he'd learn. He'd learned that actions rarely came with consequences so long as you had enough money standing behind you. That lesson sat underneath everything Tyler did at Ashford. Underneath every shove, every insult, every cruel joke at Grace Whitfield's expense. He didn't believe he could actually be stopped, and in a town like Millbrook Hollow, where his father's name was stitched onto a building at the college, he had every reason to believe that. Let's return now to the farmhouse, because time was moving there in a way that mattered more than anything happening across town. A few days after that afternoon at the diner, Grace found Earl at the kitchen table one evening with a small leather notebook open in front of him, pen moving slow and deliberate across the page. He closed it quickly when he saw her tucking it beside his chair, the way a man tucks away something private. "What's that?" she asked, setting his evening tea down beside him. "Nothing that concerns you, yet," he said, not unkindly. "Just an old man putting his thoughts in order." Grace didn't press him. She'd learned a long time ago that some doors open on their own time, and this felt like one of them. But she noticed over the following nights that he kept writing in it. A few lines here, a few lines there, the particular focus of somebody who understood in some quiet corner of himself that his time might be shorter than either of them wanted to admit. She didn't know yet that the notebook held more than just an old man's private thoughts. It held a record, a promise passed down, a story that had been waiting patiently for years to be told, one that would matter enormously before this whole ordeal was finished. For now, though, Grace's focus stayed exactly where it needed to be, keeping her grandfather calm, keeping the farm running, keeping her own worries locked away where they couldn't add stress to a house that couldn't afford any more of it. Earl's surgery was now 11 days away. She reminded herself almost daily, counting down the way you count down to something you're both dreading and praying for at the same time. She had no idea that Tyler Cross was about to make that countdown a great deal harder to bear. It happened on a Friday night, just a few days after the afternoon at the diner. Ashford College was hosting a bonfire that weekend, some tradition tied to homecoming, and half the student body had gathered on the edge of campus, music playing, laughter carrying across the cool autumn air. Tyler had been drinking. Not a lot, but enough to loosen whatever thin restraint he usually carried. He and 3 friends, Marcus and 2 others who'd been there at the farmer's market, had wandered away from the bonfire toward the tree line that separated campus property from the county road, the same shortcut path Grace sometimes walked home along. It wasn't an accident that they were there. Tyler had been watching for her, had noticed the pattern of her walks, the way people notice things about someone they've decided to make their target. When Grace appeared on the path walking home after dropping off supplies at the diner, her mind on nothing more dangerous than getting home in time to check on Earl's evening medication, she didn't see them until it was too late. "Well, look who decided to take the scenic route," Tyler called out, his voice a little too loud, a little too loose from the drinks. Grace stopped walking. Her instincts, honed over years in gyms and rings, told her immediately that this was different from the market, different from the quad. There was an edge in the air that hadn't been there before. "I'm just heading home," she said calmly. "Not looking for trouble." "Course you're not," Tyler said, stepping closer, his friends fanning out slightly behind him. "You never are. That's the thing about you, farm girl. You just take it. Every single time." Grace's eyes moved quickly across the group, 4 of them, all bigger than her, all emboldened by alcohol and the false courage of numbers. She thought about her father's promise, about the restraint that had carried her this far, but she also thought about something else, something Earl had told her once, back when she was young, and asking why he'd ever stopped fighting professionally. "There's a difference, Gracie, between backing down and being smart. Sometimes the smartest thing a fighter can do is know when the numbers aren't in her favor and get herself somewhere safer before deciding what happens next." She turned to walk the other way, back toward the lit path near the bonfire, where there would be witnesses, where this foolishness would have to end. That's when Marcus, the stocky one from the quad incident, grabbed her arm, not gently. "Where you going?" he said, grinning stupidly. "Party's just getting started." Grace's whole body went cold and calm at the same time, the particular stillness of a person who is trained for exactly this kind of moment, even while hoping she'd never need to use it. "Let go of my arm," she said, quiet, even absolutely serious. For half a second, something in her voice made even Marcus hesitate, but Tyler, fueled by pride and alcohol and months of believing he could do anything without consequence, laughed it off. "Come on, don't be dramatic," he said. "We're just having a little fun." What happened next happened fast, and it happened exactly the way bullies imagine these moments will go, right up until it doesn't. They pulled her off the path, deeper into the trees, laughing the whole time like it was some kind of game. Grace didn't fight back the way her training would have allowed. She held herself in check, some deep, disciplined part of her mind still counting the numbers, still weighing the promise she'd made her father, still hoping right up until the very last second that this would stop before it went any further. It didn't stop. They tied her wrists with a length of rope somebody had brought for the bonfire, the kind meant for tying logs, not people, and pushed her back against the trunk of an old oak tree at the edge of the clearing, a tree that had stood there, according to town history, since before the county courthouse was even built. A tree with a small brass plaque nailed into its bark, dedicated decades ago to the memory of local veterans who never came home from their wars. They thought it was funny. Poetic justice, one of them called it, though none of them seemed to understand what the word actually meant. The bark was rough against her back, cold with the coming autumn night. Somewhere behind her, the bonfire crackled faintly, its glow reaching just far enough through the trees to catch the shine of a phone screen already recording. Grace felt the rope tighten around her wrists, felt the particular helplessness of restraint she hadn't chosen, and for one brief moment, something ancient and instinctive rose up in her chest. The trained fighter beneath the calm farm girl, ready to move, ready to break free, the way her body knew exactly how to do. She held it down. She thought of her father's hands wrapping hers before every match. She thought of the promise made in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. Not out of anger, only out of love. So she stood still instead and let them have their laughter, because some fights aren't worth winning if winning costs you the person you promised to become. Someone smeared mud across her cheeks, laughing the whole time, calling it war paint, calling her names that don't need repeating here. Someone else pulled out a phone and started filming, the way cruelty always seems to need an audience these days, as if suffering doesn't count unless somebody's watching it happen. Grace stood there, tied, humiliated, mud on her face, and said nothing at all. She simply watched them, memorized their faces, memorized their voices. The particular tilt of Tyler's smirk, the nervous laugh of the friend standing slightly apart from the others, the one who didn't seem entirely comfortable with what was happening but didn't stop it either. She would need every one of those memorized details soon enough, though she had no way of knowing that yet. Standing there in the cold and the dark with mud drying on her face. That friend's name was Cody Baird, a second-year student who had only fallen in with Tyler's crowd because his roommate happened to know Tyler from a shared econ class. Cody laughed along that night the way you laugh when you're afraid of becoming the next target yourself if you don't. But his laughter came a half-second late every single time, and his eyes kept drifting toward the rope, toward Grace's face, with something that looked less like amusement and more like quiet shame. He would remember that half-second delay for a long time afterward. Shame has a way of doing that. It sits patient, waiting for the moment a person finally decides to do something about it. It is worth saying plainly before we move on that cruelty in moments like this is rarely just the loudest voice in the group. It is also every quieter person standing nearby deciding that silence is easier than stepping in. After several long minutes bored with their own cruelty the way bullies always eventually become, Tyler and his friends wandered back toward the bonfire, laughing, already telling each other how funny the video was going to look once they posted it. They left Grace there, tied to the tree in the growing dark, without a second thought about what might happen to her before someone finally came along. That someone, as it turned out, was Ruth Calder. Ruth had closed the diner a little early that night, tired after a long shift, and had decided to take the shortcut path home herself, the same path that ran along the edge of the Ashford campus. She heard something before she saw it, a faint rustling, a muffled sound that wasn't quite a cry because Grace even now refused to give them that. Ruth's flashlight found her a moment later, tied against the old oak tree, mud streaked across her face, wrists raw from rope she hadn't struggled against nearly as much as she could have. "Oh my God," Ruth breathed, rushing forward. Grace, hold still, I've got you." Her hands worked quickly at the rope, years of tying and untying delivery boxes at the diner, making quick work of the knots. "Who did this?" Ruth asked, voice shaking with anger now instead of shock. "Who did this to you?" Grace, free now, rubbing at her raw wrists, looked at Ruth with an expression that was somehow calm, even in the middle of humiliation. "Doesn't matter right now," she said quietly. "I need to get home. Earl can't know about this." "Not with his heart the way it is." Ruth stared at her, stunned by the request, but understanding immediately why it mattered. "Grace," she said carefully, "this isn't something you just walk away from." "I know," Grace said, "but not tonight, please, Ruth, not tonight." What Grace didn't know in that dark clearing beneath an old oak tree was that Ruth Calder had done more than simply find her. Walking the path only minutes earlier, drawn by the sound of laughter and something in her gut that told her to pay attention, Ruth had pulled out her own phone and recorded nearly 2 full minutes of the scene from a distance, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, too frightened to intervene alone against 4 young men, but unwilling to simply walk away either. She hadn't told Grace yet, partly out of shock, partly because she wasn't sure in that raw and frightening moment what the right thing to do with that footage even was. Tyler Cross's family held enormous influence in this town. Richard Cross's donations kept half the local businesses afloat during the slow winter months, including, in a roundabout way, the small loan Ruth had taken out years ago to keep her mother's diner from closing after a bad harvest season nearly bankrupted half the town's regular customers. Speaking up against Tyler Cross wasn't a simple decision, not in Millbrook Hollow, not when so many livelihoods quietly depended on staying on the right side of that family's goodwill. But Ruth had seen something in those 2 minutes of footage that she couldn't simply forget. She had seen cruelty, plain and clear, aimed at someone who had never once given these young men a reason for it. She walked Grace home that night, staying quiet about the recording, unsure yet what to do with the weight of what she now carried in her pocket. Grace slipped into the farmhouse quietly, washed the mud from her face before Earl could see it, and told him when he asked why she was later than usual that she'd simply lost track of time, helping Ruth close up the diner. It wasn't entirely a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth either. Sometimes protecting the people we love means carrying a little more weight ourselves so they don't have to carry any of it at all. That night, lying awake in her childhood bedroom, Grace stared at the ceiling for a long time, replaying every second of what had happened. She thought about her promise to her father, about never using her hands out of anger. She had kept that promise tonight, even tied to a tree, even humiliated in front of a phone camera that would probably circulate around campus by morning. But she also thought, for the first time since arriving in Millbrook Hollow, about a different kind of promise. One her father never spoke aloud, but had lived by his entire life. The promise that protecting people sometimes matters more than protecting your own comfort. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted, unsure what the coming days would bring. She woke up to find out just how much worse things could still get. Word travels fast in small towns, and even faster on college campuses. By Saturday afternoon, a version of what happened at the bonfire had already begun spreading through Ashford College, though not the version that actually happened. Tyler, sensing correctly that word might eventually get out about what he and his friends had done, had gotten ahead of the story in the worst possible way. He told a very different account to anyone who would listen. In his version, Grace had wandered drunk into their bonfire gathering uninvited and had started a confrontation herself, shoving one of his friends first. The rope in his telling had simply been an overreaction born from trying to restrain someone acting erratically, nothing more than a misguided attempt at keeping the peace that had gotten a little out of hand. It was, of course, a complete fabrication, but it was told with the particular confidence of someone who had never once faced real consequences for his lies, and in a town where the Cross family name carried weight and where Grace Whitfield was still, to most people, simply the quiet farm girl nobody knew much about, the lie found an audience willing to believe it. By Monday morning, the story had reached the office of Ashford College's Dean of Student Affairs, a cautious man named Harold Pruitt, who valued institutional reputation above almost everything else, and who had, not coincidentally, overseen the very same donation paperwork that had brought Tyler Cross into the school in the first place. Dean Pruitt called an emergency meeting that same afternoon, not to investigate what had happened to Grace, but to discuss what he called a liability concern regarding the farm supplier who had, according to the story circulating, created a disturbance on campus grounds. It was a small, quiet, bureaucratic sort of cruelty. The kind that rarely makes headlines but does just as much damage as the loud kind. Around campus that same Monday, a strange kind of quiet settled over students who had actually been near the bonfire that night. A few of them had seen enough or heard enough secondhand to feel a small itch of doubt about the version Tyler kept repeating. But doubt is a fragile thing when it stands alone against a confident voice and a familiar last name. Nobody wanted to be the first to say something out loud, and so for the moment, nobody did. That kind of silence has a cost too, even when it looks like nothing is happening at all. By Tuesday, a letter arrived at the Whitfield farmhouse addressed to Earl, informing him that Ashford College's cafeteria services would be discontinuing their weekly produce order from Whitfield Farm, effective immediately, citing what the letter vaguely called concerns regarding recent conduct. Earl read the letter twice at the kitchen table, his face growing pale in a way that worried Grace far more than any argument could have.
"What conduct?" he asked, looking up at her. "Gracie, what is this about?"
For a long moment, Grace considered lying again, considered protecting him a little longer. But looking at the letter in his shaking hands, she understood something clearly for the first time. This was no longer something she could shield him from. The very thing she'd been trying hardest to prevent stress reaching her grandfather's fragile heart had arrived anyway, delivered by the same institution that was supposed to represent education and decency. She sat down across from him, took a breath, and told him everything. The market, the quad, the bonfire, the rope, the tree. Earl listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every sentence, his hand gripping the edge of the table hard enough to turn his knuckles white. When she finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, staring down at that letter. "They cut our contract," he said, finally, voice low and steady in a way that somehow frightened Grace more than shouting would have. "Over a lie." "I'll figure something out," Grace said quickly. "We'll manage without the college contract. I don't want you worrying about this, not with the surgery coming." Earl looked up at her, something fierce and sorrowful mixing together behind his tired eyes. "Gracie," he said quietly, "there comes a point where staying quiet stops being patience and starts being permission. You understand me?" Grace didn't answer right away, because somewhere deep down she was starting to understand exactly what he meant, even if she wasn't ready yet to admit where that understanding might lead. Word in Millbrook Hollow doesn't stay contained to a college campus for long. By Wednesday, the whispered version of events had made its way to the feed store, to the pews of First Baptist, to the checkout line at the grocery on Main Street. Grace felt it the moment she walked into town that morning to pick up supplies. Mrs. Halloway, who ran the fabric shop and had always given Grace a friendly nod before, looked away quickly, instead pretending to study a bolt of cloth that didn't need studying. Two men outside the hardware store lowered their voices as she passed, though not quite low enough. "Heard she caused quite a scene up at the college," one of them muttered. "Surprised, given how quiet she always seemed," the other replied. "Guess you never really know." Grace kept walking, chin level, eyes forward, the way her father had taught her to walk into a ring, even when the crowd was against her, before the first bell ever rang. It hurt more than she expected. Not the words themselves, but the speed at which people she'd never truly known had decided based on nothing but a lie confidently told exactly who she must be. That is a particular kind of cruelty, too. The kind that doesn't require fists or rope. It only requires a community's willingness to believe the version of a story that requires the least effort to accept. Not everyone believed it, though. That's worth saying clearly. Old Mr. Fenwick, who ran the feed store and had known Earl Whitfield for nearly 50 years, stopped Grace on the sidewalk that same afternoon. "Don't you let this town's gossip get under your skin, young lady," he said, gruff but kind. "I've known your grandfather since before your mother was born. Whitfields don't start trouble, never have." It was a small kindness, but Grace held on to it the rest of that day like a stone in her pocket, something solid to grip when everything else felt uncertain. Pastor Whitmore, too, made a point of greeting her warmly outside the church that Wednesday evening Bible study, loud enough for a few of the gossiping women nearby to hear clearly. "Good to see you, Grace," he said, shaking her hand. "How's your grandfather holding up? Tell him the whole congregation's praying for that surgery." It wasn't a grand gesture, just a pastor being decent to a young woman in a difficult week. But small gestures offered publicly have a way of quietly correcting a narrative that cruelty has tried to write. Still, for every Fenwick and every Pastor Whitmore, there were 3 or 4 others content to whisper and assume, and Grace felt every one of those whispers, even the ones she pretended not to hear. She thought more than once that week about how much easier it would be to simply tell the truth, to explain what had actually happened at that bonfire, to let people see Tyler Cross for exactly what he was. But every time she considered it, she thought of Earl sitting at that kitchen table with the cancellation letter trembling in his hands, and she pushed the thought away again. 10 days until surgery, then 9, then 8. Every day that letter sat unanswered on the kitchen counter felt like a small betrayal of the truth, but every day she held her tongue felt like protection for the only family she had left. That tension between truth and protection, between speaking up and staying quiet, sat on her shoulders like a weight she carried into every single day that followed. That evening, after helping Earl to bed, checking his pills, making sure his heart medication was exactly on schedule despite everything happening around them, Grace walked out to the barn alone. She didn't open the trunk this time. She simply stood beside it for a long while, one hand resting on its worn wooden lid, thinking about promises, about patience, about the difference between turning the other cheek and simply letting cruelty walk all over the people you love. She didn't have answers that night, only questions sitting heavy in her chest about how much longer patience could hold against a lie this large. Eventually, she went back inside, checked on Earl one last time, and lay awake a long while before sleep finally took her. Across town, in a diner that had closed for the night, Ruth Calder sat alone at her counter, staring at a video still saved on her phone, wrestling with a decision of her own. She thought about her mother, who had built this diner from nothing. She thought about the loan the Cross family's bank had approved for her years ago, the kind of favor a small business owner doesn't easily forget in a town this size. And she thought about a young woman with mud on her face, tied to a tree, who had asked for nothing more than to be left in peace. To understand why that decision weighed so heavily on Ruth Calder, you need to understand a little more about her. Ruth's mother, Dottie Calder, had opened that diner 32 years earlier, back when Millbrook Hollow still had 2 grocery stores and a working movie theater on Main Street. Dottie had run it through good years and hard years, through a fire in the kitchen that nearly closed the place for good, through a drought year so bad that half her regular customers couldn't afford to eat out at all. When Dottie passed 6 years ago, Ruth had inherited not just a diner, but a debt. The old building needed a new roof. The kitchen equipment was older than Ruth herself, and the bank that had extended the loan to keep the diner alive during those hard years happened to be the same bank sitting on Richard Cross's board of directors. It wasn't charity exactly. Ruth had paid every payment on time with interest, same as anyone else. But there was an understanding in a town like Millbrook Hollow, unspoken but deeply felt, that certain families held certain kinds of power over certain kinds of futures. Crossing the Cross family publicly wasn't simply a matter of losing a few customers. It carried the quiet possibility of a called-in loan, a denied refinancing, 100 small inconveniences that could add up to real trouble for a small business already running on thin margins. Ruth thought about all of that sitting alone in her diner that night, phone in hand, the footage of Grace tied to that old oak tree sitting there like a stone she couldn't decide whether to throw or swallow. She thought about her mother, too, about the woman who had taught her that a diner wasn't just a business. It was a promise to the town, a promise that anyone who walked through that door, tired or broke or lonely, would be treated with basic human decency. Dottie Calder had never once in 32 years turned away a hungry stranger for lack of money to pay. Ruth doubted her mother would have hesitated for even a moment about what to do with that footage, regardless of what it might cost her. She still didn't know exactly what she would do with it, but she knew one thing clearly now, sitting there in the quiet of her empty diner. Whatever she decided, it would not be nothing. Now, let's turn for a moment to Coach Walt Daniels, because he had his own reckoning happening that same week, quieter than Ruth's, but no less important. By Monday morning, the rumor about the bonfire had already reached him, the way rumors always reach the coach of any athletic program, eventually. He'd heard Tyler's version first, told secondhand by one of his assistant coaches, who'd heard it from a student in the weight room.
Some farm girl caused a scene at the bonfire. Tyler and the boys had to handle it. Coach Daniels had nodded along at the time, the way you do when a story doesn't quite sit right, but you don't yet have anything solid enough to challenge it with. But something about the phrase, handle it, stuck with him the rest of that day, turning over and over in his mind like a stone in a shoe he couldn't quite shake loose. He'd coached young men for 15 years. He knew the particular tone boys used when they were covering for something. He'd heard that same tone from Tyler Cross more than once already this semester, usually right before some story about a missed curfew or a broken piece of gym equipment turned out to be considerably less innocent than first reported. It was a small thing, that tone. Most people wouldn't have noticed it at all, or would have let it pass without a second thought. But 15 years of reading young men before a fight had taught Coach Daniels to trust the small things more than the loud ones. That afternoon, he pulled Tyler aside after practice, ostensibly to discuss his footwork, though footwork was the furthest thing from his mind. "Heard there was some trouble out by the bonfire this weekend," he said, watching Tyler's face carefully. Tyler shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow with a towel, not quite meeting his coach's eyes. "Nothing big," he said. "Some girl got out of hand. We handled it." "Handled it? How?" Coach Daniels asked. "Just, calmed her down. Nothing serious." Coach Daniels studied him a moment longer, the same way he studied a fighter's stance before deciding whether the confidence in front of him was real or simply well-rehearsed. He said slowly, "I've been coaching a long time, Tyler. I can usually tell when a story's been trimmed down to make somebody look better than they behaved." Tyler's jaw tightened just slightly. "I'm not lying, Coach." "Didn't say you were," Daniels replied evenly. "Just said stories get trimmed sometimes. Might want to think about that next time you're telling one." He left it there, not because he believed Tyler's account, but because he had nothing solid enough yet to challenge it with directly. Still, that conversation lingered with him the rest of the week, mixing uneasily with the memory of a young woman's perfect, effortless footwork on the quad, and 2 faint letters stitched into the lining of an old pair of gloves. Something was not adding up about Grace Whitfield, and something was not adding up about Tyler Cross either. Coach Daniels had spent his whole career learning to trust his instincts in the ring. He decided quietly to start trusting them outside of it, too. He didn't know yet how soon those instincts would prove exactly right. Neither Ruth nor Grace knew it yet, but their 2 decisions, one about a hidden video, one about an old promise, finally reaching its limit, were about to collide with a truth neither of them could have predicted. A truth that had been waiting patiently, folded quietly inside an old notebook by Earl Whitfield's bedside for exactly the right moment to finally be told. That moment was closer than any of them realized. Before we close this part of the story, it's worth sitting with something for a moment. Cruelty rarely announces itself as cruelty. It almost always arrives wearing the costume of a joke, a prank, a bit of harmless fun that got a little out of hand. That's how it convinces good people to stand by and watch. That's how it convinces even the person doing the harm that he hasn't really done anything wrong at all. Tyler Cross told himself walking away from that tree that night that it was nothing serious, just a joke. Nobody got hurt. But somebody did get hurt, just not in a way that showed up as a bruise or a broken bone. Dignity is a fragile thing, and once it's been taken from someone in front of a crowd, it takes a great deal of courage to get it back. Grace Whitfield found that courage in the smallest of places, in choosing silence over vengeance, in protecting an old man's heart over defending her own reputation, in trusting somewhere deep down that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even when it takes its time getting there. Ruth Calder found her own courage growing slowly, the way courage often does. Not in one grand decision, but in 100 small ones. In refusing to look away on that path through the trees. In keeping a piece of footage she wasn't yet sure what to do with, because some part of her understood that truth
deserves to be protected even before you know exactly how to use it.
And somewhere across town, a young man named Cody Baird carried a half-second of delayed laughter home with him that night, the beginning of a conscience finally waking up to what it had allowed to happen. None of these people knew yet how their choices would come together, but that is how real change usually happens in a community. Not through one dramatic act of heroism, but through many small, quiet decisions made by ordinary people who finally decide that watching is no longer enough. Earl Whitfield's surgery was now 8 days away. The letter from Ashford College still sat unanswered on the kitchen counter. And somewhere in a barn behind that farmhouse, an old wooden trunk held secrets that were about to matter more than anyone in Millbrook Hollow could yet imagine. Grace Whitfield had spent her whole life believing that quiet strength was enough, that patience, given enough time, would always win out over cruelty. But standing there, in that barn beside a trunk holding the only proof of who she really used to be, she began to wonder for the very first time whether some situations require more than patience. Whether some lies grow so large they can only be answered with the truth, and whether the time for staying quiet, no matter how deeply she believed in her father's promise, might finally be coming to an end. Outside the barn, the wind picked up, rattling the old tin roof, carrying with it the first real chill of the coming winter. Somewhere, out past the tree line, an owl called once, then went silent, as if the whole farm were holding its breath along with her. Inside the farmhouse, Earl slept on, unaware of the weight his granddaughter was carrying, alone in the cold dark of the barn. His breathing stayed even. His heart, for now, kept its steady, careful rhythm, the same rhythm the doctors were racing against with every day that passed. Grace stood there a while longer before finally heading back inside, past the chicken coop, past the old fence line, under a sky that had gone fully dark now, thick with more stars than any city ever offered. Somewhere across that same sky, in a dormitory room lit by a laptop screen, Tyler Cross was already rehearsing his story again, smoothing its edges, preparing for whatever questions might come next. He had no idea that a diner owner's phone, a coach's growing suspicion, and an old man's notebook were all quietly moving toward the exact same Monday. Neither did Grace. But some storms announce themselves slowly, gathering strength in silence long before anyone feels the first drop of rain. This one was almost ready to break. Every story reaches a point where waiting is no longer possible, where the truth held quiet for so long finally has to stand up and speak for itself. This is that part of the story. Let's begin where we left off. 8 days remained until Earl Whitfield's surgery. A cancellation letter still sat unanswered on the kitchen counter, and somewhere across town, 2 people were each carrying a piece of truth they hadn't yet found the courage to share. It was a Wednesday morning when everything finally started to move. Grace came downstairs to find Earl already sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him gone cold, and a worn leather notebook resting under his folded hands. He looked up at her, and something in his face told her this conversation had been waiting a long time to happen. "Sit down, Gracie," he said quietly. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." She sat across from him the way she had 1,000 mornings before, but this one felt different, heavier. The kind of morning a person remembers for the rest of their life. "You know, I loved your father," Earl began. "Loved him like my own son, even before he married your mother. But there's a part of his story I never told you. Partly because it was his to tell. Partly because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it." Grace waited, hands wrapped around her own cup, saying nothing. "Your daddy served this country for 3 years before he ever set foot in a boxing gym," Earl said. "Enlisted right out of high school. Came home a different kind of quiet than the one he left with. The kind of quiet that comes from seeing things a young man shouldn't have to see." Grace felt something settle in her chest, a piece of her father she'd never known, sliding gently into place. "He never talked about it much," Earl continued. "But he came to me not long after he got back, said he needed somewhere to put everything he was carrying. I gave him a pair of gloves and told him the same thing my own father told me.
Anger needs somewhere to go. Better it goes into leather than into people. He tapped the notebook gently. He wrote in here for years, long before you were born. Kept writing even after you came along, right up until his heart finally gave out. Earl's voice caught slightly. There's a page in here near the end where he wrote down exactly what he wanted for you. Not fame, not championships. He wrote that he hoped one day you'd use everything you learned to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Said the whole point of strength was never about winning. It was about who you chose to stand beside. He slid the notebook across the table. Grace opened it with careful hands, the paper soft and worn from years of handling, and found the page Earl meant. Her father's handwriting slanted, and familiar words she read twice before she could speak again. He knew, she said quietly. About Tyler. About all of it. No, Earl said gently. He couldn't have known that. But he knew you, Gracie. Knew exactly the kind of woman you'd grow into. He wrote that page long before any of this happened because he trusted you'd need it someday. Grace closed the notebook slowly, holding it against her chest, the way she'd once held those old gloves in the barn. I've been trying so hard to keep quiet, she said. To protect you. To keep my promise. I know, Earl said, and I'm proud of you for it. But there's a difference between keeping a promise and hiding from the truth. Your daddy never once ran from a fight worth having. He just made sure every single time that he was fighting for the right reasons. He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip weaker than it used to be, but steady, all the same. 2 days ago, you asked me why I told you not to let anybody go through that trunk, he said. Truth is, I wasn't protecting a secret, Gracie. I was protecting a piece of your father and a piece of you until I thought the world was ready to see it. I think that time has come. Grace looked at her grandfather for a long moment, the weight of everything he'd just handed her settling somewhere deep and permanent. Why now? She asked quietly. Why tell me all this now, of all time? Earl was quiet for a moment, choosing his words, the careful way an old man chooses words he doesn't intend to waste. Because I watched you carry this whole burden alone for weeks, he said. Watched you protect me from worry. Protect this town from a truth it wasn't ready for. Protect a promise you made to a man who loved you enough to ask something hard of you. That's a lot of protecting for one young woman to carry by herself. He tapped the table gently with one finger. Your daddy didn't make you promise never to fight, Gracie. He made you promise never to fight out of anger. There's a difference, and I think it's time you let yourself see it clearly. Grace felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular relief of finally being understood. I've been so afraid, she admitted. Afraid that if I said anything it would look like revenge, like I was just as bad as him. Telling the truth isn't revenge, Earl said firmly. Revenge is wanting somebody to hurt. Truth is just wanting people to see clearly. Those aren't the same thing no matter how similar they might feel in the moment. He picked up his cold coffee, took a sip anyway, grimacing slightly at the temperature. Your father used to say something else too, he added almost as an afterthought. Said the whole reason he came home from the service and put his energy into that ring instead of somewhere darker was because somebody finally told him the truth about himself when he desperately needed to hear it. Said sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is refuse to let their lie stand unchallenged. Grace thought about Tyler then, about the version of himself he'd built out of money and excuses and other people's silence. Maybe she thought speaking the truth wasn't just protection for herself. Maybe it was the only real chance Tyler Cross had of ever becoming something better than the version of himself his father's money had allowed him to be. They cut our contract over a lie, she said finally. The whole town thinks I started something I didn't start. Then it's time the whole town learned the truth, Earl said simply. Not for revenge, never for revenge, but because silence has already cost us enough. Later that morning, after Earl had gone to rest, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, with the notebook still open in front of her, and read the page again, slower this time, letting her father's voice fill the quiet room the way it used to fill their small kitchen when she was young. He had written it years earlier, back when Grace was only 10 years old, long before any of this trouble had a shape or a name. "I hope she grows up gentle," he had written. "Not soft. Gentle is different. Gentle is strength that has decided on purpose not to hurt anyone who doesn't need hurting. I hope somebody tries to test that gentleness someday, and I hope she proves them wrong about what it means." Grace read the line 3 times, feeling something in her chest loosen and tighten at once. Grief and comfort tangled together the way they so often are. She turned the page, curious now, and found a shorter entry beneath it, written in the same careful hand, dated only a few months before her father passed. "Earl tells me my heart isn't what it used to be either," he had written. "Funny thing thinking about that. I always figured strength was something you built. Turns out some of it just gets handed to you, quiet, from people who loved you before you knew how to say thank you for it. I hope Gracie learns that lesson faster than I did." She closed the notebook, gently held it against her chest for a moment, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to simply cry. Not from fear, not from anger, just from missing a man who had somehow known, even from all those years away, exactly what his daughter would need to hear. Then she wiped her eyes, stood up, and went to find Earl, ready now to face whatever came next. That same afternoon, across town, Ruth Calder made a decision of her own. She'd spent the better part of a week wrestling with what to do about the footage sitting on her phone, torn between the safety of staying quiet and the discomfort of watching a young woman's reputation get quietly destroyed by a lie. In the end, it wasn't fear of the Cross family's bank that tipped the scale. It was a customer. An elderly woman named Constance Argyle, a regular at the diner for as long as Ruth could remember, had come in that morning, settled into her usual booth, and mentioned, almost in passing, how disappointed she was to hear about the trouble that Whitfield girl had caused up at the college. "Never would have guessed it," Constance said, shaking her head over her coffee. "Seemed like such a sweet, quiet thing." Ruth had stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, and felt something inside her finally snap into place. "She didn't cause any trouble, Constance," Ruth said, voice steady. "I was there. I saw exactly what happened, and it wasn't her fault. Not one bit of it." Constance blinked, surprised by the firmness in Ruth's voice. "What do you mean you were there?" Ruth set the coffee pot down, took a breath, and told her the truth for the very first time out loud. Word travels fast in a diner. By the time the lunch rush arrived, half the regulars had heard some version of Ruth's account, and for the first time since the rumors started, doubt began creeping into the story Tyler Cross had so carefully constructed. Ruth made one more decision that afternoon. She called the office of Ashford College's Dean of Student Affairs and requested a meeting, saying only that she had information relevant to a recent incident involving a student named Tyler Cross. Dean Harold Pruitt, more out of institutional caution than genuine concern, agreed to a formal hearing the following Monday, giving both sides a chance to present their account before any further action was taken regarding the farm's supplier contract. That gave everyone involved exactly 5 days to prepare for a meeting that would decide far more than a produce contract. It was decide whose truth this town was finally going to believe. News of the hearing spread quickly, the way news always does in a place this small. Coach Daniels heard about it from Dean Pruitt himself, who mentioned it casually in the hallway, still treating the whole matter as little more than an administrative inconvenience. But something about the word hearing settled uneasily in Coach Daniels' stomach. He thought about that conversation with Tyler after practice, about the phrase, "handle it," and the way Tyler's eyes had slid away from his when he said it. He thought about the flinch on the quad, the gloves in that barn, 2 letters stitched into worn leather that had been quietly haunting him for weeks now. That evening, Coach Daniels did something he probably should have done much sooner. He drove out to an old friend's house 2 counties over, a retired boxing journalist named Pete Kowalski, who had covered the amateur circuit for nearly 30 years before his knees finally gave out on him. "Pete," he said, settling into a worn recliner in Pete's cluttered living room,
I need you to tell me everything you remember about a fighter called the Quiet Storm. Pete's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a couple years, he said, leaning forward with the particular excitement of an old man given a reason to talk about his favorite subject again. Undefeated. Every single amateur bout. Never gave an interview, never showed her face outside the ring without a hood pulled up. Some folks thought it was all a gimmick, some kind of mystery marketing angle, but I saw her fight twice up close. That girl had something you can't teach. Instinct, patience. She'd let an opponent tire themselves out swinging at air, then finish it in 2 clean punches, calm as you please. Any idea what happened to her? Coach Daniels asked. She just vanished. Is that right? Pete nodded slowly. Word in the gyms was her father passed, heart trouble, I heard. She walked away not long after, right when offers for something bigger were starting to come in. Coach at the time was heartbroken about it, but respected her decision. Never heard a name for her outside that ring nickname. Whole point of the mask, I suppose. Coach Daniels sat quiet for a long moment, pieces settling into place with a certainty that felt almost frightening. Pete, he said carefully, what if I told you I think she's living about 20 minutes from my house right now, working a farm with her grandfather? Pete's eyes went wide. I'd say you better be sure before you go saying something like that out loud. That kind of thing gets a young woman more attention than she probably wants. I know, Coach Daniels said, but there's a hearing on Monday that might need exactly that kind of certainty. He drove home that night, turning the whole conversation over in his mind, understanding now that whatever happened at that hearing, he had information that could change everything, and a responsibility to decide carefully how and when to use it. The night before the hearing, Grace drove into town and found Ruth sitting alone in the diner after closing the same way she had that first night after the bonfire. Couldn't sleep, Ruth admitted, sliding a cup of chamomile tea across the counter instead of her usual coffee. Figured you couldn't either. Grace wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to hold on to. I keep thinking about what happens if they don't believe us, she said quietly. Even with the video, people believe what's easy to believe, Ruth. And easy in this town usually has the cross name attached to it. Ruth reached across the counter and took her hand. Let me tell you something my mother used to say, she said. She used to tell me that the truth doesn't need everybody to believe it right away. It just needs enough people willing to say it out loud so it has somewhere to stand while the rest of the world catches up. Grace managed a small, tired smile. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was stubborn, Ruth said, laughing softly, which in this town turns out to be pretty close to the same thing. They sat together a while longer, 2 women who'd met as strangers only weeks before, now bound together by something neither of them had asked for, but both had chosen to stand inside of anyway. Thank you, Grace said eventually, for not looking away that night. On the path. You could have kept walking. Ruth shook her head firmly. I thought about it for about half a second. Then I thought about the person I'd have to look at in the mirror every morning after that. Wasn't a hard choice once I framed it that way. Grace nodded slowly, understanding something clearly in that moment about courage. That it rarely feels brave while you're living it. It usually just feels like refusing to accept the easier, uglier option sitting right in front of you. She drove home late that night under a sky heavy with the first snow clouds of the season, feeling for the first time in weeks something close to steady ground beneath her. Monday arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that makes a person pull their coat a little tighter. The hearing was held in a conference room at the administration building. Long table, uncomfortable chairs, the particular sterile lighting that makes even innocent people look guilty. Dean Pruitt sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 members of the Student Conduct Board. Tyler Cross sat on one side with his father Richard Cross beside him, dressed sharp, expression calm, the posture of a man who had never once lost a room he walked into. Grace sat across from them, Earl beside her, despite her protests that the stress of the trip wasn't good for his heart. He'd insisted, quietly but firmly, that some things a man shows up for, no matter what it costs him.
Ruth sat beside Grace too, phone in her bag waiting for the moment she'd need it. Tyler's account came first, smooth and confident, exactly the version he'd been telling for a week now. Grace had wandered into their gathering uninvited, started a confrontation, and things had simply gotten out of hand, while his friends tried to calm the situation down. Richard Cross added a few remarks about his son's good standing in the community, about the family's long history of supporting Ashford College, phrased just carefully enough to remind everyone in the room exactly how much weight his name carried. Dean Pruitt nodded along the posture of a man already halfway convinced, already thinking about how quickly this uncomfortable matter could be resolved and forgotten. Then it was Grace's turn to speak. She told the truth, plainly, no embellishment, no accusations dressed up bigger than they needed to be, just exactly what had happened, from the market to the quad to the bonfire and the tree. Her voice never rose. She didn't point a finger, didn't raise her chin in anger, didn't ask for sympathy from the board members watching her closely. "I never once raised a hand against any of them," she said near the end, looking directly at Tyler for the first time since sitting down. "Not because I couldn't. Because I promised somebody I loved that I wouldn't. That promise mattered more to me than proving a point to people who'd already decided not to believe me." For a moment something flickered across Tyler's face. Not quite guilt, not yet, but something close to it. The first small crack in the story he'd been telling himself for weeks. One of the board members, a quiet woman near the end of the table who hadn't spoken yet, asked Grace gently why she hadn't come forward sooner, why she'd let the rumors sit unchallenged for so many days. Grace considered the question carefully before answering. "My grandfather has a heart surgery in a few days," she said. "I was more worried about protecting him than protecting my own name. I still am, honestly. But I've learned recently that sometimes protecting the people you love means telling the truth loud enough for them not to have to carry it alone." The board member nodded slowly, something in her expression softening. Tyler's lawyer present at Richard Cross's insistence immediately suggested it was simply one account against another, a matter of he said, she said, nothing that warranted further action. That's when Ruth stood up. "It isn't just her word," she said, voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "I have video." The room went very quiet. Ruth played the footage on her phone, passed it around the table so each board member could see clearly what had actually happened that night. The rope, the mud, the laughter. Tyler's voice, unmistakable, calling out cruelties that needed no further explanation. Richard Cross's calm expression finally cracked just slightly, watching his son's voice condemn him from a small glowing screen. Tyler sat frozen, the confidence draining slowly from his face as the video played out in full. But even then, Dean Pruitt hesitated, glancing toward Richard Cross with the particular discomfort of a man weighing truth against influence. "This is certainly troubling," he said carefully. "But we should consider context. Perhaps this was a misguided attempt at some kind of tradition that simply went too far." That is the exact moment the hearing might have quietly slipped away, buried under careful language and institutional caution, if not for what happened next. The door at the back of the conference room opened. Cody Baird walked in. He hadn't been invited, hadn't been asked to attend. He'd simply heard about the hearing through the same rumor mill everyone else had, and something about that half-second delay in his own laughter, the shame that had followed him for a week straight, finally pushed him through that door. "I was there," he said, voice shaking but clear. "I was one of them. I didn't tie the rope, but I stood there and laughed, and I didn't stop it, and that makes me just as responsible as anyone else in that video." The room turned to look at him, stunned. "I want to make a statement," Cody continued, "because what's in that video is exactly what happened. Every second of it. And I've felt sick about it every day since, watching everyone believe a lie that Tyler told to protect himself." Dean Pruitt, faced now with corroborating testimony from inside Tyler's own circle, could no longer treat the matter as simple hearsay. Richard Cross's face had gone pale, the calm confidence completely gone, now replaced by the particular panic of a man watching money and influence fail to solve a problem for the very first time in his life. Tyler sat with his head down, silent, the truth finally too large and too documented for any story to cover it back up again. That's when the second surprise of the morning arrived, though this one came quietly, almost gently. Constance Argyle, the elderly diner regular, had come to the hearing too, along with 3 other longtime residents of Millbrook Hollow, all of them there simply to speak on behalf of the young woman they'd watched over the past few weeks treat every single person in this town with nothing but decency. Old Mr. Fenwick spoke about the Whitfield family's 50-year reputation for honesty. Pastor Whitmore spoke about Grace's quiet consistency at Wednesday Bible study, her patience, her kindness toward the elderly congregants who struggled with the church steps. Constance simply said that she'd been wrong to believe a rumor before hearing the whole truth, and that she was sorry for it. It wasn't a courtroom drama moment exactly. No dramatic gavel banging, no shouted accusations, just a handful of ordinary people finally deciding that silence had gone on long enough. Coach Daniels had been sitting quietly near the back of the room throughout the entire hearing, watching everything unfold, weighing the last piece of information he still hadn't shared. Now, with Tyler's lies exposed and the room finally ready to hear something true, he stood. "There's something else the board should know," he said. "Something that doesn't change what happened here today, but might help explain why." He looked at Grace, a question in his eyes, silently asking permission before he continued. Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding once, understanding somehow that the time for keeping this particular truth hidden had finally, quietly, come to an end. "A few weeks ago," Coach Daniels said, "I watched this young woman avoid an aggressive shove from Tyler Cross using footwork I've only ever seen from trained fighters. Since then, I've done some research. Miss Whitfield fought amateur boxing for several years under an assumed name. She was undefeated in every sanctioned bout she ever competed in." A murmur moved through the room. "She never once used that training to retaliate against any of this," Coach Daniels continued. "Not at the market, not on the quad, not even tied to a tree in the dark. I think that says a great deal more about her character than anything else presented here today." Grace felt her cheeks flush, unused to this particular kind of attention, but she didn't deny it. There was no point anymore in denying what had simply become the truth, finally standing where it belonged. Earl, sitting beside her, reached over and took her hand, pride written plainly across his tired face. Dean Pruitt, faced now with video evidence, a corroborating witness, community testimony, and a revelation none of them had seen coming, had no reasonable path left except the truth. The board's decision came within the hour. Tyler Cross was suspended from Ashford College for the remainder of the academic year, with formal disciplinary action noted permanently on his record. His athletic scholarship tied directly to his standing on the boxing team was revoked immediately. He was required to issue a public apology, both to Grace Whitfield and to the college community at the next scheduled assembly. Richard Cross, faced with the very real possibility of a lawsuit and the kind of public embarrassment money couldn't quietly erase this time, made a decision of his own that afternoon. He approached Ruth privately after the hearing concluded, an expression on his face that mixed genuine shame with the practiced calculation of a man used to managing damage. "I understand my son owes your business an apology too," he said, "for the way he's treated you and your customers. I'd like to offer something more than words. A grant through our family foundation to help renovate your diner. No strings attached. It's simply the right thing to do." Ruth considered him for a long moment. "I'll accept help for the diner," she said finally, "because my mother built that place for this whole town, not just for me. But you should know something, Mr. Cross. The right thing to do isn't a check. It's teaching your son that people matter more than whatever he can get away with." Richard Cross had no response for that. He simply nodded, quiet in a way that suggested perhaps for the first time something in him had actually heard it. The farm's contract with Ashford College was reinstated that same week, along with a formal letter of apology from Dean Pruitt himself. But the reinstated contract was, in truth, the smallest part of what changed that day. The public assembly took place the following Friday, held in the same auditorium where Tyler had once accepted an award, for his undefeated first semester on the boxing team. Grace almost didn't attend. Part of her wanted the whole ordeal simply to end quietly, without another moment spent in front of a crowd that had, until recently, been so willing to believe the worst about her. But Earl encouraged her to go, not for herself, he said, but because sometimes a community needs to witness an ending as clearly as it witnessed the trouble in the first place. She sat near the back, Ruth on one side, Earl on the other, watching as Tyler Cross walked slowly to the podium, a version of himself, far smaller and quieter than the one who had smirked over an apple crate just weeks before. He read from a paper his father's lawyer had almost certainly helped draft, stiff and formal at first, apologizing for conduct unbecoming of an Ashford student. Then, partway through, he stopped reading. He looked up, found Grace's face in the crowd, and set the paper down. "I'm not going to read the rest of this," he said, voice unsteady, "because it doesn't sound like me. It sounds like something written to make everybody feel better and move on quickly." The auditorium went very still. "I did something cruel to somebody who never once did anything to deserve it," Tyler continued. "And the only reason I'm standing here admitting it is because I got caught. That's the truth, and I think you all deserve the truth more than you deserve a nice speech." He looked directly at Grace. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I don't expect you to accept it. I wouldn't in your position, but I am sorry, and I'm going to spend a long time figuring out how to actually mean that instead of just saying it." It wasn't a perfect apology. Grace didn't feel any sudden rush of forgiveness listening to it, and she didn't owe him one either. But it was, she thought, watching him step down from that podium, the first honest thing she'd ever heard him say. Sometimes that is the most anyone can offer at the start of becoming someone better. Not immediate transformation, just the first honest sentence spoken out loud in front of people who have every right to expect more. Word of the hearing spread through Millbrook Hollow within hours, and this time the truth traveled just as fast as the lie once had. By that evening, the same Mrs. Halloway who had looked away from Grace outside the fabric shop stopped by the farmhouse with a pie, an unspoken apology carried in the crust, and the careful way she avoided meeting Grace's eyes for too long. The two men who had whispered outside the hardware store tipped their hats to her the next time she passed, an acknowledgement that needed no further words. Small towns are capable of great unfairness, but they are also capable, when given the chance, of correcting themselves with real sincerity. Millbrook Hollow, given that chance, took it. Earl's surgery took place 3 days later, exactly on schedule, in a hospital 2 counties over. Grace sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, the longest 6 hours of her entire life, holding her father's old notebook in her lap like a small anchor keeping her steady. When the surgeon finally came out tired but smiling and told her the procedure had gone exactly as hoped, Grace cried for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not from grief this time. From relief, so large it needed somewhere to go. Earl recovered slowly over the following weeks, color returning to his face day by day, strength returning to his hands as autumn gave way to the first frost of winter. He was back on the porch within 2 weeks, grumbling about his doctor's orders to take it easy, insisting he felt fine enough to help with the fence line, despite everyone telling him otherwise. Grace let him think he'd won that particular argument, though she made sure he never actually lifted anything heavier than his coffee cup. It was during that recovery, sitting together on the porch one crisp afternoon in early November, that the final piece of this story arrived, quiet and unexpected, the way the best surprises often do. A car pulled up the gravel drive and a woman in her 50s stepped out, introducing herself as Diane Marsh, Regional Director of the Amateur Boxing Federation. Grace, wary at first, invited her to sit, Earl watching curiously from his rocking chair. "I heard about what happened here," Diane said, settling into the offered seat. "Word travels in this sport, even about fighters who've stepped away from it." "I'm not here to ask you back into competition, Miss Whitfield. I understand that chapter is closed, and I respect that completely." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I'm here about something different. Our federation runs a community outreach program teaching boxing fundamentals to adults facing difficult circumstances. folks working through addiction recovery, veterans readjusting to civilian life, single parents looking for something steady to hold on to. We've been looking for someone to lead a new chapter of that program in this region. Someone with real skill, real patience, and real understanding of what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. Grace sat quietly absorbing this, glancing instinctively at Earl, who was smiling in a way she hadn't seen since before his surgery. "Your father's old notebook," Earl said softly before Grace could respond. "Read the last page again sometime. He wrote almost exactly this, Gracie. Said he hoped you'd use what you learned to help people who needed steady hands more than they needed champions." Grace looked back at Diane Marsh, something settling into place inside her chest. A purpose she hadn't realized she'd been quietly searching for since the day she left the professional circuit behind. "I'd like to hear more about it," she said. That conversation marked the beginning of something new, a chapter neither cruelty nor gossip nor fear had any part in writing. Winter came fully to Millbrook Hollow not long after, and with it came the opening of a small community boxing program held twice a week in the gymnasium at Ashford College, offered free of charge to anyone in the county who needed it. The first session drew only 6 people, standing awkwardly in loose rows on a gymnasium floor that still smelled faintly of fresh varnish. A woman in her 40s, recently sober, hands shaking slightly as she pulled on a pair of donated gloves for the very first time. A man who'd spent 2 decades in construction before a back injury took his livelihood looking for something to do with restless hands and a restless mind. A young father, exhausted and uncertain, who admitted quietly to Grace after that first class that he hadn't done anything just for himself in almost 3 years. There was also an older man near the back of the group, a retired mechanic named Sam, who'd come, he admitted sheepishly, mostly because his daughter had signed him up without asking, worried about how much time he was spending alone since his wife passed. He stood a little apart from the others at first, arms crossed, clearly certain he didn't belong there. By the end of the hour, Sam was laughing along with the construction worker, the two of them comparing sore shoulders like old friends already. Grace noticed him linger a little longer than the others before leaving, glancing at the gloves rack near the door. "Same time Thursday," she told him. "I'll think about it," he said, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. He was there Thursday, and every session after that for as long as this story has any way of knowing. Grace walked among them slowly, adjusting a stance here, softening a clenched jaw there, speaking in the same calm, unhurried voice her own father had once used with her. "You don't need to hit hard," she told them more than once that first evening. "You need to hit smart. Strength without control just wears you out. Control is what lasts." By the end of that first hour, the sober woman was smiling, sweat on her brow, something loosening visibly in her shoulders that hadn't been there when she walked in. The construction worker laughed for the first time in weeks, missing a combination badly enough to stumble, catching himself with a grin instead of frustration. The young father left, promising he'd be back Thursday, already looking steadier than he had an hour before. Grace watched them go, one by one, out into the cold parking lot, and felt something settle inside her that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not the hollow satisfaction of a hand raised in victory after a match, something quieter, something that felt for the first time entirely her own. Ashford College, in a quiet gesture of its own reckoning, asked Grace if she might allow a small display in the athletic building's trophy case, honoring the history of the sport within the region. Grace agreed, on one condition. She brought in her father's old gloves, the worn leather pair with 2 faint letters stitched inside the cuff, and asked that they be displayed, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of restraint, of patience, of a promise kept even when keeping it was hard. A small plaque was placed beneath them, simple and unadorned. "Strength is not in the hands that strike. It is in the hands that choose not to." Coach Daniels stood beside that display the day it was unveiled, Cody Baird among the small crowd gathered to see it, having spent the intervening weeks quietly volunteering at the new community program as a way of making right what he hadn't stopped in time. Grace found him afterward near the edge of the crowd, looking like he wasn't sure whether he belonged there.
"You didn't have to keep coming back," she told him. "To the program, I mean. Nobody would have blamed you for staying away."
Cody shook his head. "I would have blamed myself. Showing up is about the least I can do, considering." "It's not the least," Grace said. "It's actually a lot coming back after something like that."
"Plenty of people never do."
He didn't quite know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, and the two of them stood together a moment longer, watching the plaque catch the afternoon light. Tyler Cross was not there. He had left Millbrook Hollow entirely by then, transferred to a smaller school 2 states away, carrying with him a lesson far more valuable than anything his father's money had ever purchased for him. Some lessons, the hardest ones, only truly take root after the comfort of easy consequences has finally run out. Ruth's Diner reopened that same winter, freshly renovated, busier than it had been in years, the whole town seeming to find its way back through those doors with a little more warmth than before. And on a quiet Sunday afternoon in December, Earl Whitfield sat on his porch, a blanket over his knees, watching his granddaughter walk a group of nervous, hopeful strangers through their very first boxing stance in the yard below. Her voice carried gently across the cold air, patient, steady, the voice of someone who had learned the hard way that real strength was never about being the loudest person in the room. It was about choosing, again and again, to stand quietly beside the people who needed you most. Earl watched her for a long while, breath visible in the cold, heart beating, steady and strong beneath his coat. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he thought about his old friend, gone too soon, about a promise kept across 2 generations, about a town that had in the end chosen to remember decency over rumor. And he thought quietly that whatever years he had left, he intended to spend every single one of them exactly like this, watching his granddaughter teach the world something it desperately needed to relearn. That gentleness is not weakness, that patience is not surrender, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes carrying more strength and more grace than anyone around them ever bothered to notice. Before we let this story go, there's one more thing worth saying plainly. The world is full of people who look ordinary: farmers, waitresses, old men on porches, quiet young women with mud on their boots. We are quick to decide who deserves our respect based on how loud they are, how much money sits behind their name, how confident they seem walking into a room. But real character rarely announces itself. It shows up quietly in the choices nobody is watching, in a promise kept when breaking it would have been easier, in a kindness offered before anyone asks a single question in return, in the courage to finally say out loud what silence had been protecting for far too long. Millbrook Hollow learned that lesson the hard way, the way most towns do. It took a lie that traveled faster than the truth. It took an old man's failing heart and a diner owner's quiet courage and a coach willing to trust his instincts and a young man brave enough to admit his own shame out loud. It took all of that together before the town finally saw clearly what had been standing in front of them the whole time. A young woman who never once needed to prove how strong she was, because she already knew. And in the end, that knowing, quiet and unshaken, was the thing that changed everything. It changed a town's opinion of a stranger it barely knew. It changed a young man's understanding of consequence. It changed an old man's final years, giving him back a granddaughter who had come home not just to care for him, but to build something neither of them could have imagined that first foggy morning in September. And somewhere, in a gymnasium that used to belong only to trophies and titles, it changed the way a whole community understood the word strength. Not loud, not boastful, not measured in wins, just steady, patient, present. Exactly the way Grace Whitfield had been all along, from the very first day she pulled up that gravel drive with nothing but a duffel bag and a promise she intended to keep, and every single day after that, whether anyone in Millbrook Hollow happened to be watching or not.